Hello and welcome everyone. We have a good crowd here today for a very special guest, so I'm really excited. Um, just the first 2 minutes, I'm going to say a few things about this discussion. It's part of our project called Pushing the Boundaries, which is about the difference between living and non-living systems. And I think we're going to talk a bit about this as well today. So the format, for those who haven't been here yet, is quite simple. We have a quick introduction of our guest by Kevin today, and then Adam will talk for about 10, 15, 20 minutes. We'll see about some topic that he wants to discuss with us, and then we'll have a panel discussion between Kevin, Paul, and me till the hour is full, and then we open up the discussion for questions from the audience. A few quick rules. If you have questions, we are recording this session. We'll upload the discussion on YouTube for the project outreach part of the project afterwards. So if you do not want to be seen, you can keep your camera off for the whole time and just write your questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll read it for you. If you want to ask questions yourself and be seen, then switch on your cameras, please, when we open the discussion up to the audience. In the meantime, for recording purposes, please have your cameras and microphones off until then. Rules of engagement, please, when you want to say something, raise your hand, stay civil, of course, and don't interrupt, stay on topic, avoid jargon. We usually have very interdisciplinary audiences here, and we also want to address interdisciplinary audiences on YouTube. So don't engage in too technical discussions, please. That's it for me, and I'll hand over to Kevin for the introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Yogi, and thanks a lot to Adam. It's a great pleasure, and also an interesting or ironical thing to me to talk about you while you're right here and you're the expert on your own biography. So I'm sorry if something is not that to the point, but I think there we already right in the topic of the blind spot. What's your view on you, or maybe someone else is knowing more about you already, but we will see that later on. So Adam Frank is a distinguished astrophysicist, an author, of course, and a science communicator. And he explores the really profound connections between the cosmos and, let's say, human experience, human consciousness to some degree. So maybe the widest gap we can possibly think about. And so covers a lot of ground. And he's a professor right now at the University of Rochester, I think for physics and astronomy. And he studies really the origins and evolution of planets and civilization. So I think also going into astrobiology. And while his writing also includes the light of the stars, but now we are talking, or today we're talking about this one, The Blind Spot, without doing too much merchandise. And I really liked and enjoyed the book. I can recommend it by myself. And it challenged us to rethink really the broad spot of science and how to encounter it. And this is thought-provoking and it bridges a lot of elements. So we thought, especially for our project, it really comes to deep connections. And I'm thrilled to have you here today, and I'm looking forward to meet you in person as soon as possible and to really embrace this complexity and perspectives and wonders, especially because I think you're covering cognitive science, physics, philosophy, all the things I also studied and we have in our group. So looking forward to it. And the stage is yours.
Because I've been following your guys' work quite a bit, and I'm very interested in it for actually, this other project, this other Templeton project that we've been doing on semantic information. So it's been fitting with this broad range of questions that I've been asking about, which come out of The Blind Spot, our book as well, about agency and autonomy, new views of nature. So the title here is Beyond the Blind Spot Towards a New View of Nature, which is, I think, what we're going to argue is required. So this is the book. So, just I wanted to show for people who don't know what actually we covered in the book The book is about this idea that science has a blind spot, or at least the metaphysics associated with science has a blind spot, which is experience. And the book is quite wide-ranging, which is why there was three of us writing it, myself, Marcelo Gleiser, and the philosopher Evan Thompson. So we deal first with the philosophical basis, the historical setting, and then dealt with sort of physics, the blind spot in physics, and then the blind spot in life and mind. And we end with thinking about the Earth as kind of an example. Earth system science is at least a vague way of sort of saying like, well, this is what science might look like once you get past the blind spot. But really, the next book has got to be about the science beyond, what comes after the blind spot. All right, so the central metaphor here is that at the heart of science lies something which is necessary for science, but which we cannot see. And so, this is like the metaphor of the optic nerve, the blind spot that is caused by the optic nerve. And so what is the blind spot for science? It is human experience, which can go by many names. In Zen, there's this thing about like what is so close. It's because it's so close, it's so hard to see. And I think with science, this idea of experience, which people want to automatically say, oh, you mean being an observer? And it's like, no, being an observer is very far downstream theoretically from what we're talking about. And so this goes by various names. Direct experience was, I believe, William James's idea. Lived experience comes from the phenomenological tradition. Presence is another word, just the raw presence. You're just, every morning you wake up, you're in the world. You're not going to be out of the world until you're dead, and then, who knows? Being, so for Heidegger and such, this idea of being, Dasein was an important idea. And then again, back to phenomenology, the life world also, Husserl's idea of the life world. And so this precondition, this already having to be in experience as the precondition for the possibility of doing science is what we're trying to point to in the book. And by ignoring it, well, our argument is that science, you often, can be quite useful to ignore it for certain kinds of problems, but for other kinds of problems, you just end up contorting yourself, and you end up with paradoxes and all kinds of problems because you've ignored it. So let's just spend a moment on how did we get here? Why is there a blind spot in science? And on one argument, you might be able to say, part of this from philosophically is because of science arose out of the Western core, so to speak, of civilizations, which were both the Abrahamic and the Greek philosophical traditions, which had a single all-knowing God, which sort of presents the frame. And much of what we're going to be arguing is what the blind spot, it's the metaphysics of the blind spot, posits a kind of God's eye view, that science gives us this God's eye third person view. And, if you didn't already have sort of God sitting there in the background, even if you were rejecting that in the, 1600s, it still was there. And so that's just one way of sort of thinking about it. But really where it comes from is from classical physics, which is, I like to call the empire of dynamical equations. So what you have in the rise of laws of physics, which comes out of, first the 1500s with Galileo, building off of the Mertonians, what was happening in the scholastic period, was this idea that there were these dynamical equations, this movement in mathematics and thinking how mathematics is applied to the world from geometry, these, static figures of, pure Platonic beauty, to dynamical equations, things that had dt in them, had derivatives in them. And that, rather than what we were interested in was change occurring between elementary particle, change occurring in terms of motion for elementary particles. So first you have Newton's laws, but then as time goes on, you start going through this spiral of abstraction. Newton's laws, which are actually quite cumbersome to work with for complicated situations. You get Lagrangian formulation of dynamics. Still, it's Newton's laws, but it's now a much more abstract formulation. And then finally, you end up with the Hamiltonian form, which is now very abstract, very beautiful, very potent and powerful, allows ideas like phase space to come into the language of physics. And this is so supremely I guess somebody wants to come in. Am I supposed to click that? I just did. This is so supremely potent that people get the idea that these laws of physics from physics, or that physics is really the ultimate, the basal structure, the basal way, the most foundational way of describing the world. Okay. All right, so that's where this idea that, like, all of the world, all of everything in the world can be reduced to a basic set of particles and their laws, and everything above that is an epiphenomena in some way. It's really, once you have the Lagrangian, say, for the standard model of particle physics, and then also Einstein's equations for space and time, you're done. Everything else is just, if you had God's computer, you'd be able to figure out everything, including life and mind. So when we talk about the blind spot, it's really this constellation of ideas. Not everybody has them, but in general, thinkers who work within this, and this is the dominant model in science today. Maybe it's beginning to crack a little bit, but certainly in the popular conception of science, it's these ideas are the way people think about science. And so it's reductionism, right? The idea that everything goes back to the most fundamental particles and their laws. Everything else is just computations about those arrangements of particles. The second is the idea of objective ontologies. This is where I was referring to the idea of why it may not be surprising that this arose in a European conception of science, since they had that. And this is the idea that what science gives you is the perfect third-person view of the world. Materialism and physicalism, that in this third-person view of the world, the only thing there is stuff, either particles or particles and fields, and everything else, again, is just an epiphenomena. The only thing that's truly real are particles and fields. Along with this is also the idea of the reification of mathematical laws, that these laws exist somehow. They're sort of eternal and timeless. They exist outside of the universe they describe. This is, Platonism. Most theoretical physicists, myself included, we certainly start off as Platonists because it's just, the equations are so beautiful and so potent that it's hard not to believe that they have, sort of a life of their own. And then finally, this idea that experience is an epiphenomenon, that anything about experience really, it's just, neural computations going on in the brain. There's sort of, there's the primary qualities of the world, which are the things associated with the particles. And then there's the secondary qualities like, redness, which is really just, there really is no red. There's no experience of red. There's really just, wavelengths of light produced by interactions with matter. Okay, so these are the ideas. These are the things that comprise the blind spot, and they manifest themselves in different ways in different fields. But for all of them, as you can see, the last one, experience, this direct experience is not important. It's not fundamental. It's not real. In fact, experience is reducible to the matter or fields, of physics. And it's those laws that we've reified that govern those behaviors, which lead to this this illusion, so to speak, of experience. So yeah, experience is not important. So we are pushing back against that idea, and of course, when you push back, you have philosophical heroes. And the first of our heroes is Alfred North Whitehead, who is one of the great mathematicians. It's interesting that we're going to have two mathematicians here who are going to be our philosophical heroes. So the first is Alfred North Whitehead, who, even though, he's going to develop his own metaphysics, which you don't have to really embrace to understand. I think what was more important was his critiques of this was even quantum mechanics was just even beginning. So even some of the things, the ways that quantum mechanics pushes very hard against the blind spot, he didn't even need yet. So the first conceptualization that he's going to use against the blind spot is the idea of the bifurcation of nature, this conceptual split between physical nature and direct experience. And he's arguing that this is a bifurcation, that you get two systems of reality, which is really where the mind-body duality come from. And he was arguing that you should this is a huge mistake, that you should not divide nature into two kinds. There's not two systems. And as he says, the red of the sunset is just as much a part of nature as the molecules and light waves by which science explained it. And so, he was setting the task for philosophers and scientists to understand how to have this be one system, not two systems. And then part of this was also the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And I really love this. The accidental error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. And this is the most important, or not, this is a very important point. The experience is given. It is not reducible to anything. Experience is, as I've said, it's the, I call it, it's the condition that you need in order to have, science. It's a precondition for the possibility of doing science. It is not reducible. It is just given to you, and now you've got to work your way out of it, from it, to your science and your conceptions of nature. So whereas, the problem with what science in general is trying to do is have from this third person view, which are, that third person view only comes from these ascending spirals of abstraction, which literally purposely push experience out in order to gain its structural invariance, as Michel Bitbol would call them, and then thinking you can work your way back. You have this, this terribly thin, skeleton of theoretical structures, and that came from experience, and then thinking you can jam experience back in there. That's the real mistake. Okay, our second hero was also a mathematician, which was Edmund Husserl, the founder of the field known as phenomenology. And Husserl talked about the surreptitious substitution, that the universe of mathematical physics is promoted to the status of objective reality. And in the book, we use this, the parable of temperature, and we talk about how the long historical process by which the bodily experience, the embodied experience of hot and cold, got slowly over time by scientists working together in what is called the workshop, this common space of interaction, developed first the idea even of thermometry, that there's degrees that you could measure temperature in. That's what Bitbol would call a structural invariant that comes out of experience, comparing experience. And then all the way up to, statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, that somehow that's seen as being more real than the experience of hot and cold. So this idea of where is it? Yeah, that perceptual world gets demoted to the status of mere subjective experience here, because we start taking degrees Celsius to be more real. Like there's actually degrees Celsius out there in the universe than the bodily experience of hot and cold. He also calls this the amnesia of experience. We forget that all of our scientific theorizing came because experience was already given. We already found ourselves in the world. And then through a very particular process, that we evolved culturally, we're able to talk about it scientifically. Instead, the whole thing gets flipped on its head. And experience is seen as the thing that's derived. And as Husserl said, what happens here is you take for being true, which is what is actually a method for describing experience. So that's the amnesia of experience. Okay. So that's really all I'm going to talk about with the blind spot. We can unpack it. You guys can unpack more what's in there. What I really now want to go is a little bit beyond it, because this is what I'm interested in talking with you guys with, is can there be a post-blind spot science? So the important thing we're saying is the blind spot is not science. Science is just a method for interrogating the world. The blind spot is a metaphysics that got pinned on science. It made sense in 1880. By the time you got quantum mechanics, it was already falling apart, but it certainly doesn't make sense. And now it really doesn't make sense. And from cosmology to cognitive science, it just leads us into paradoxes and problems that we then end up, taking these very strange philosophical stances on. For example, in quantum mechanics, where experience, the Born rule is telling you experience a la measurement is important, we end up with an infinite number of unobservable universes because we don't want to deal with that, right? The many worlds interpretation. We don't want to deal with the idea of experience, so we end up with, an infinite number of unobservable universes just to not deal with the primacy of experience. So the way I like to put it is, from the blind spot view, what the idea is like, we have physics and we have to embed experience within physics. But the post-blind spot view is the other way around. I want to know why physics is possible given experience. I want to start with experience and its structures, its phenomenal structures, and ask myself, how is it that there could be physics? Because these abstractions of physics are incredibly powerful and they need an account. This does not in any way, degrade the importance of physics. They need an account. Okay, so what this really requires is a new image of nature. We have to stop thinking of nature as being something out there. And we need to like really understand, how do we have an image of nature that starts from us, right? Because there's only first person experience and second person, because I can't have first person experience without the second person, right? Life is always part of a community. So I'm using language because I'm part of a community of language users, and this community of language users is part of embedded in ecosystems, all the way up to the biosphere. All right, so I see it's already 25 after. I'm actually going to jump through the rest of this very quickly, just to introduce very briefly. So, this idea of trying to think about life from a physics point of view, but in a non-blind spot way, has an interesting history. Schrodinger actually asked this question. Wasn't really, we hadn't gotten quite post-blind spot, but this idea of, because what he was asking was, does dealing with life require new laws of physics? And of course, the old view of looking at life was it's a machine. It's just a machine. That's the blind spot view. It's just a biomechanical machine. End of story. You don't need anything else. But what makes life really different, and this is what I'm interested in, you guys I know think about this a lot, is the idea of organization. That organism, as Kant recognized, requires a special understanding of organization, because that's what makes life different. So, and also agency and information, right? That's what, maybe if we're trying to understand from a physics point of view in a non-blind spot way, what makes life different, it's about organization, autonomous agency. How does that happen? And then the role of meaning, of information, but not just any kind of information, semantic information. So this is what, with JTF, that we have this project on semantic information. I'm actually not going to go into it in any detail other than to note, so I'm just going to skip very quickly through this, that Shannon information, which is what we normally think of information, he was very clear that his mathematical model of information which has all this nice mathematics associated, linked to, actually ends up linking to thermodynamics because of his notion of entropy. That meaning wasn't in there. Like, he was purposely saying, I just like most of science pushed like experience out, he purposely pushes meaning out. And if we're going to have obviously life uses information. In fact, life may be the way we're going at it is that life is the only physical system that uses information. Stores, copies, transmits, uses information, but it's semantic information. It's information that has inherent meaning because of all the things that you guys know about. From the relevance to autopoiesis. So I love this definition. Information is the difference that makes a difference. Well, difference to who? Rocks don't care about information. There's no different information doesn't make a difference to a rock. It makes a difference to an agent, right? So, okay, I'm going to skip through all this. There is a theory of semantic information that was developed by Kolchinsky and Volpert. We got funding to build on that. I'm not going to go. I will completely skip through it all. We can ask about it later if anybody's interested. Whoops, go. I'll just say that the important thing about this view of information, because it's all about mutual information, it's about an agent and an environment. And what, the old way, you can kind of look at, there's the agent and the environment. And, information is about correlations. This part of the agent is correlated with that part of the environment, and so on and so on and so on. But in some sense, from this view, what you end up with is that what really matters, that both the agent and the environment are co-creating. They don't exist separately. The world and the self exist together, and it's correlations that matter. It's the network of correlations. And one view of life, this post-blind spot view, is that life is the organizational architecture, or the informational architecture of the organization. So, life is just this dense network of interactions, so dense really probably that it may not be computable, which I know you guys, this is Robert Rosen stuff. And that you are a temporary configuration, a transitory configuration of those web of correlations, and that, you know, yourself and the world as the world are co-emerge. You know, one doesn't exist beforehand. I mean, obviously there's a world without us. Clearly there's a world without us. It's just not this one. It's not the one that we inhabit as autonomous agents. Okay, so very quickly towards this, the challenges of the new view of nature is just that, you know, the great thing about the old view is you have these incredibly powerful equations. The new science has to be just as effective in terms of empirical precision and broad theoretical description. So, but without reducing the, you know, without reduction to the tools used to achieve that precision. So whatever we're building has to be precise, but we can't substitute the tools and think that the tools are in fact the thing experience that we're trying to describe. In other words, we're not meat computers, right? If your theory of cognition and consciousness turns us into meat computers, you're in the blind spot. I'll just note also here new heroes: Hans Jonas, Varela, Robert Rosen. This whole question that metabolism, autopoiesis, and closure to constraints may be the ways of getting there. These are all languages that maybe can get us there without making that mistake of the surreptitious substitution. So I want to note this paper that many of you guys here were on, which I found incredible. And I'm very interested in, like, yeah, what kind of mathematical modeling can we do? But if we're doing mathematical modeling of this is where I'll end, is that our mathematical descriptions of agency, autonomy, and how the world co-arises from them, you know, it's possible that you don't get Turing computability out of this. And that what that means is, if that's true, then all we're really doing is mimicking, not explaining. And I think we need a philosophy then of mathematical mimicry, right? To understand the difference. What does it mean to be able to capture parts of this agent, of this closed, organizationally closed system, such that we have we understand it more deeply, but we recognize we're only mimicking. Okay, so I will just, because I could still go on, I will end there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. This was the perfect discussion starter. So if I may, I will dive right in. So if I'm being asked, what is the science going to look like? Then I say a lot of it is not going to look any different. We're just going to be conscious that we're using models as tools and no longer mistake them, you know, these maps for the territory. But then at the fringes, there's this question, and that I wanted to throw back at you as a physicist. How much is it actually, to what extent is it, do you think, possible to come up with a formalized science that goes past the blind spot? And is that really the point? Is it just going to be an extended version of the science that we're already having, or is it going to look completely different? What is your opinion on that? That I would like to know.
Good question.
It's a big question, sorry.
One of the last slides I put up there is the idea of horizons, you know. So Husserl loved this idea of horizontal structures, you know. And horizon's such a cool idea because, like, you know, there's an edge, but wherever you go, you're pushing that, you know what I mean? Like, you're at the center and the horizon comes with you. And I think, you know, the post-blind spot science would formally understand that role of horizons, right? It would understand, and it would be a science that knows how to self-destruct before it started getting stupid, right? Before it started leading to the kind of paradoxes and sillinesses that can happen, you know, with physics, with things like, you know, with things we point out about modern cosmology, or again with quantum mechanics, that it would so deeply understand the horizontal structure that there would be, you know, that you could have sort of, I really would be interested in having a mathematical description of horizons, of phenomenal horizons, and how those affect theories. And it's interesting that, you know, in relativity, there are horizons, right? There's about information that, you know, there's the causal structure of reality. Maybe that's a structure, it's something that could play a role. So so things like including horizons, things like understanding how theories self-destruct, things like understanding the role of mimicry rather than thinking the equations are reality. I think there you can see really what what it would look like, what the difference would look like. That really, on some level, yes, we're going to continue doing what we're doing because there's some potent stuff there. That's what I mean about the precision, etc. But I could imagine that a post-blind spot science, because of its philosophical origins, for those and again, you don't need it everywhere. If I'm doing billiard balls, if I'm trying to do a game of a pool, I don't need post-blind spot science. Blind spot science is fine. But when it comes to like consciousness and cognition and quantum mechanics and life, the physics, whatever, and it's gonna be more than physics because of complexity science. It'll be interdisciplinary, but it may look I think it could look very, very different.
Fantastic. It's almost like an organism. It creates its own boundaries. So the theory is basically, this is why our project is called Pushing the Boundaries. We're interested in how scientific knowledge itself could be used to describe its own boundaries. And for that, it would have to have this sort of self-referential quality that theories of the organism already have. But so this is we won't go there because we want other people to ask questions as well. Paul, you had a bunch of questions lined up.
Yes, Kevin unmuted himself. Now, do you want to go first, Kevin?
I can, just as a quick follow-up maybe, because to me it sounds a bit like a possible new sort of bifurcation that we are having here right now. If we are saying for some stuff we need this post-blind spot, and for the others we stick with the ones we had before. I think that's a dangerous game to play. What about a meta spot science or something in between? And there again rises the question of having maybe an alternative or different or updated version of formalization in general. So we worked a bit with category theory, for example. So one question from our homotopology from Grothendieck, there is a lot of things going around there as well. So I just wanted to know from your professional point of view, what would you say to category theory or some other really predominant forms of possible other avenues to take in terms of formalization and doing the physics combined with Coxeye or something like that?
Yeah, I will admit, full disclosure, I know very little about category theory. And I know from Rosen, reading, I'm trying to read Rosen's paper. I'm like, I don't really understand this. Because it's interesting is that within, the physics training I've had, there's not category theory. It doesn't really show up, in learning high energy physics or the kind of astrophysics I do, or GR, or so yeah, category theory. What's interesting about it is it lies outside of the training for most physicists, and in that way, what little I've looked at, it's like, oh, this is very different. So that's all I can say. But I agree with what you're saying. I mean, when I said that pool table doesn't require post blind spot, all I really meant by that was that you don't have to confront. When science was built, when this first version of science was built, it was built for pool tables, right? And in that sense, it was super duper effective, But any reconception, reformalization, new metaphysics is going to, it's going to recognize that the pool table is the limiting case wherein you can pretend that experiences doesn't matter, but fundamentally experiences matter, right? So that's all I meant in that sense. So yeah, I'm really go ahead.
No, I totally understand. I think it's a paraphrasing to, we don't need field equations for the pool table, right? We right. use Newtonian mechanics for that. But going into complexity, how we try to think it, or you beautifully worked it out at the blind spot, is something we maybe cannot get rid of this way, or something else entirely. Yeah, but I totally see it. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, yeah, so I'm very interested in your guys' opinion on this, right? So yeah, so when I look at Rosen and I look at like Hans Jonas, so Hans Jonas is now my new hero. I just read, I mean, Jonas was new to me. I didn't really know about Jonas until reading Evan and reading you guys.
It's not in the physics training, Hans Jonas, right?
Physics training. Well, and of course, part of the problem is also phenomenology is not in the philosophical training unless you purposely go off in that direction. And physicists, if you go to a philosophy of physics conference, who's ever talking about phenomenology? It's like it doesn't exist. It's talk about blind spot, right? Oh, phenomenology, it's meaningless. It's like, really? Come on, are you kidding me? But this idea of formalizing, having a formal and a mathematical, having some kind of formal system that can understand its own limits, which, we sort of have with, Gödel, right? We have examples of that. But a system that understands self-referentiality. It's all about self-referentiality, which is where Gödel came from. All the self-referential all the paradoxes in logic come from self-referentiality, if I understand it.
And I mean that's interesting because there, for me at least, what came up now is there are kind of two directions. There are kind of the horizon self-referentiality problems that turn out in logic, basically, and then in the variations you have the halting problems and the tasky sentences and the equivalent statements in various domains, basically. But then there's also something different with complexity theory, which is just chaos or the complexity, and you can calculate stuff, but the sheer numbers involved and the sheer complexity, as it's called, also provide a limiting case, but a limiting case of a slightly different nature, I feel like, because it's not a it is on a different level. So what you said earlier, I think that there was something interesting that stuck for me, was kind of this: when we consider the pool table and the billiard balls, we also have to, whenever we do science, we have to be very clear about the types of questions we ask, and kind of the coupling of the model to the system that we're trying to study. And yes, for the billiard balls, there is a nice coupling to be made between Newtonian mechanics and the dynamics of the billiard balls. But once you want to extend this and want to do some celestial mechanics, then you get problems due to relativity theory that become problematic. So I think within this, so where I kind of want to go is kind of this question of this post blind spot, because it's interesting. Can there be something as a post blind spot if we stick with that metaphor of the blind spot, and then like the blind spot still remains? It's always going to be there. We can't get rid of the blind spot on some deep level because the blind spot is and will always be there. We can only become aware of it. So, but within that framework, in some sense of a post blind spot scientific endeavor, how do you suggest we think about this coupling between a theory and then the specific task we apply to, and how does this domain specific application work out? Because what I always feel is that you can then take any specific model that you have and you try to bend it and extend it, and it necessarily breaks at the edges. So in a super interdisciplinary, super complex science, for someone like you coming from so many disciplines, how does I guess there are now a bunch of questions in there, but how does that also work in terms of an educational process?
Yeah, well, I think there's this idea of polyepistemology, right? There's a great quote. I highly recommend to everybody David Krakauer's introduction. I think he's now made it into a separate book. The Santa Fe Institute put out he's putting out this amazing series of books, which are foundational papers in complexity theory. And he's got this great introduction. And then he talks about like the idea of like there's going to have to be a lot of epistemologies. There's a lot of narratives. There's not one narrative anymore, right? So like with life, there's the physical narrative, sure, that's fine, but it's not enough. And then there's what we're working on, the informational narrative, and that may not be enough. And that they're all this idea that what physics desired, and again, I think it's so much because we inherit from the Greeks and from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that there should be one. There should be just one perfect description, the God's eye view, as opposed to like there's many ways to tell a story. And actually, there's work to be done there in formalizing that. Let's say I have an informational narrative and I have a physical narrative, and I recognize there are two different ways of approaching something. All right, well, what metaphysically does that mean, in terms of the world I'm trying to describe? Because I think once you understand that experience is irreducible, then now you shift sort of what you think you're doing when you're doing science, right? The old view as a theoretical physicist was I was trying to read God's mind, right? I had professors tell me that, like, oh, the glory of, to read the thoughts. I think, Newton says this somewhere, in Newtonian physics, when he was trying to ground, his idea of absolute space and time, in the Scholium, he refers to the divine perspective, right? So once you give up the divine perspective, now you recognize, well, oh, I'm coming at it from lots of different views. I think, some of this, the problem is we need to formalize this. And there may be, you know, from category theory, other ways to have a mathematics of polyepistemology. That's the good work going forward, I think, is to try and, you know, what is right now very unclear and foggy, you know, to actually put bite into it. And you see that path from Jonas to, you know, to Varela to Rosen. You can see how these ideas that seem sort of very nebulous have, and where we are now with like the work you guys are doing and the work at SFI, starting to get some real edge to it, you know, some real mathematical edges to it. So I think we can already see sort of at least there's a route. You know, there's a metaphorical route about how this can become sharpened.
If I may do a quick follow-up and kind of try to also get you talking a bit about semantic information, because I think that's a very interesting topic. Because if we look at the Shannonian formulation of information theory, like in his initial paper, he basically laid out the whole field and also plucked all the fruits, and like there's just kind of everything in there. It's amazing. It's hardly ever happened that you have this initial paper and then the whole field is already is established in there. But you, of course, then have the criticisms of Bateson, and you continue kind of to look for organisms, and you see that you get problems with this type of information theory because it doesn't really account for, is this information actually relevant for a being? There's this interrelationship or this co-creative act that you also started talking about isn't really established. So but what we've been also looking at is kind of, so how can an information theory of an organism basically look like? And I think there's then the thing that you get your information theory for the organism and you start working on that. But then I think where it gets super tricky, and where it gets super difficult with all of those cases is then kind of how do you move from one of those levels to the next, and how do you interrelate them? Because then you have the Shannonian stuff that works, and then you have the semiotic information theories or biosemiotic theories of organisms that work. But then I think the super interesting and tricky stuff is always kind of how do you then actually manage to connect those domains? And I think so. I want to pose this as a direct question: what avenues you see there in this particular example, but then also as a broader topic. How do you see those? How do you see this process of interconnecting those domains of structural, often similar but still distinct knowledge?
Yeah, I agree. That, I mean, that is definitely the good work ahead, right? To try and figure that out, because even in semantic information, the stuff that we're working in, the Kolchinsky and Wolpert paper, you know, you have to state the phase space. You have to state like sort of the state of possibilities for the agent and the state of possibilities for the organism. So you start off with this big system, and you have to say, oh, that's the agent and that's the environment. Right. And so already there, you sort of, you know, you're stepping in and making that split. What you want is a theory of how these things co-emerge. And that's really, I think, like, yeah, you know, there's a number of different ways of trying to have this ideas of information working as semantic. So there's functional information, you know, people have posed there's a lot of different ways. The way it's done in the work we're doing, the theory that we're working on, the Kolchinsky and Wolpert idea, is that you have agent and environment, and you know you look at the mutual information between them, and then you look at, you know, by doing you know, you run a trajectory, you have a viability function, you have some way of saying like, oh, you know, this thing is what makes it alive, what makes it thrive. And then you run a bunch of counter examples where you scramble the mutual information. You say like, oh, you know, we just mixed up the information. And then you see whether in these counterfactuals, how well the thing survives. So you can sort of see which information of the total Shannon information, which part of it mattered for the organism's existence. And that's a very potent way, and you learn lots of interesting things. But again, it doesn't talk about the emergence. So now this is something I wanted to go back to from some of the other questions you're asking. You know, you pointed out these two different problems. One is self-referentiality. The other is complexity. You know, the thing that complexity brings to us, I think, is beginning of a deeper understanding of emergence. You know, there's all these philosophical questions about emergence, strong emergence, weak emergence, etc. But I think at some point, you know, we can start working the two together: emergence and self-referentiality, right? How does emergence and top-down causation, once you can establish top-down causation, to what degree does that begin to establish the ability for something to be an autonomous agent, hence self-referential. So all this stuff, I think, my reading, this is pretty new over the last, what, couple of decades. And it's super exciting. So, we're not there yet because we really, it seems to me, I'm from the outside, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. But it seems like, Rosen, 1966 is Jonas. Rosen is like what, the 90s? Varela is the late 70s, 80s. This is all pretty new and was pretty on the edge, and is only now seems to be entering mainstream.
Yeah, so Rosen actually started in the 50s. That's quite amazing, and he never published anything with anyone else. He was just a loner. So that's
who was this? Who was publishing?
Rosen, yeah, 59, the first papers. So
wow.
And a lot of the book, The Fundamentals of Measurement, is actually a really interesting book, which the title doesn't sound like it's interesting, but it actually is. But because it starts with this absolutely basic assumption that you have a system. So you cannot, just like in physics, when you model a system, you don't have first principles, no symmetries, conservation laws that would guide your modeling efforts. So this problem of relevance realization that we've talked about in that paper that you mentioned is a problem of formalizing the model in the first place. And with all the approaches you mentioned before, even category theory, you're formalized already. So is this something that you can describe from within science? That's one of the questions we're going after here.
Yeah. I hope so. Science may look different. The science you get may look different. But I completely agree that is a super deep question. Because you can see the problem with, right. You have to formalize. You have to already have a frame in which to posit the question. But, one possibility may be in this recognition of the difference between the macro state and the micro state, right? So I've just read some interesting papers about the use of epsilon machines to understand how that decoupling happens. And so, again, once we have a community of people really applying themselves to this, we may develop techniques for understanding. That's why I'm so interested in mimicry, right? If what you think you're doing is not, offering an alternative reality, to the one that we experience, but instead you're mimicking experience, then you may have a system of formality that also understands its boundaries, that understands it lives within a horizon. So this is always going to be a science that's going to live much closer to philosophy, right? Whereas, like, you get all these physicists saying incredibly stupid things about philosophy. Physics doesn't need philosophy. What has philosophy done for physics? Not recognizing they're making philosophical statements, right? The future, there'll be a much, especially at least at these kinds of things, there'll be a much closer communication between physicists and philosophers and biologists and computational scientists and maybe anthropologists. It's part of this is the lowering of the boundaries between the sciences. So your thing about pushing the boundaries, it's very arbitrary that and it only came about as an accident in history that there's physics departments which are different from biology departments, which are different from chemistry departments, that ironically computation may actually, those in the future those divisions aren't going to mean as much.
So I would say we open up already to the audience, because I saw that Kevin Mitchell had his hands up before. Unless there are some pressing questions from Kevin or Paul, are you guys okay opening up? Kevin, do you still have a question? You lowered your hand again.
I think he left.
Kevin is gone, I fear. Just one Kevin left.
Ah, so you triggered him and then he left. I don't know. So we'll never know. We'll never know what Kevin's question was.
Kevin.
Okay, so are there any other questions from the audience for Adam at this point? I have one or two about more of the science communication and education aspect, so let's leave those for the end. But yes, please, audience. You can switch your cameras on if you want.
It looks like Daniel had something he wanted to say.
Oh, Adam, gosh, what an honor to hear you say my name, sir. Thank you so much. I'm a lawyer in San Diego, and I'm just soaking all this in. This is all new to me, and I'm loving it. Thank you for everything you guys do. It's amazing. I put a question in the chat. I found you on Lex Fridman, and I've just been watching all the videos I can find, and then I went on Facebook, and that's how I found this group. And thank you guys for putting this together. For me as a beginner, I mean, I started watching Sarah Walker. You mentioned her; she's amazing. My question, as a beginner, is there other, because you mentioned a lot of books, a lot of people, any other, I mean, those are like the easiest thing for me to do is just watch videos. Any other like Lex Fridman's I should watch, or Joe Rogan's, or any other scientists I should look up?
So Daniel, can I ask you to contact Adam privately for this? Because
Sure.
we want to focus on the philosophical and scientific discussion during the
Sure.
90 minutes
Okay.
we have. Is that okay?
I don't know how to contact
Thanks.
him, but I'll try. I'm sure I can find it.
Okay.
If you go to my
cool.
website, actually, you can. There's a thing you can ask.
There's a forum.
But I
Yeah.
would say Sarah's book. Have you read Sarah's book?
Okay, Sarah's book. All right.
Sarah's book is quite good. Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any topical questions on the topics we've been discussing? Tom, yes.
Yogi, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand except actually, not virtually.
That's totally fine.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed The Blind Spot. I've reviewed it at naturalism.org. Terrific book. I disagree with it. Question for Adam. Adam. If mathematics isn't really a way to objectify things, but we have to experience as fundamental. Sure, I agree it's fundamental in that we can't get outside of it as human beings, as persons. But the thought experiment I want to run is you have a mathematical theory, you put it out there, you send it to the Andromeda galaxy. Will it be comprehensible by a non-human system? Perhaps a conscious system. It seems to me that the language of mathematics does, in a sense, transcend one's conscious experience by virtue of abstraction. So isn't it in principle possible that a completely different sort of consciousness could comprehend a mathematical theory, a physical theory that you're familiar with? And therefore, wouldn't that be a kind of objectivity that would transcend at least our human experience?
That is a great question, Tom. And as an astrobiologist, I think about dealing with my other life is started doing technosignatures. So we think about this a lot. And then this was the idea of contact. Carl Sagan was like, yeah, we'll send them pi, and then and we'll start with addition, and then after a while we'll be trading knock jokes and cures for cancer, as I like to say. But one of my favorite movies is science fiction movies, contact movies, is Arrival. And what I think is powerful about Arrival is the role of the linguist, right? They send in Carl Sagan and a linguist. And Carl Sagan tries exactly this, tries to show him math, and it fails miserably. The linguist understands that language is embodied. Language is always an expression of the fact that you are in a body with particular, all the particularities of cognitive structures that being in that body and the whole history of the biosphere that body expresses. And she breaks through. She's the one. And what they find is they're living a different physics, right? They're living literally time, past, future, they're all happening at the same time for them. That movie was actually, as for much of science fiction, was really transformative for me because it made me recognize that, the physics that we get maybe just one short chapter in a much larger book, right? And that really, and there's a great paper that I would recommend by David Wolpert, who says his argument is that, we grew up on the Welt, we evolved on the Welt, and the things that we think of as physics and mathematics, he doesn't expect at all would be able to be understood by, creatures, any kind of organism that evolved anywhere else. So I'm actually, and this is interesting for me from the technosignature point of view, I think it's entirely possible that unless they had very similar cognitive structures for whatever reasons of how these things, that, they wouldn't understand our mathematics at all.
Interesting. Okay. So you're saying that our physics is derivative from our specific human kind of consciousness that derives from our specifically human sort of body. Okay. Then there's no common language.
Yeah, I'm throwing that out there as a possibility, but I really recommend David Wolpert's. He's got an Aeon article on this, and then a really long piece that you can find on Physics Archive. But I really, even though he probably is much more, he agrees with you. He thinks like formal systems are, but still it was a very provocative article, and I tend to agree with it that, you know.
Yeah.
That,
I have another question, but other people should go first if they want to.
No, I just wanted to mention here that Carl Sagan himself had this idea of these blobs, that intelligent blobs that evolved on a gas giant and never see an edge. And what kind of geometry would they develop? We developed topology very late, but their geometry would have to be based on topology first, because they don't have the concept of an edge. And so that was, I can't remember in which one of his books or interviews it is, but he came up with this idea, criticizing this idea that you could just send out Pythagoras' theorem. No, but it's another question is how you do that. You can engrave it on a disk and a space probe, but
tried that.
If you encode it digitally, I mean, you have to have someone decode it on the other side. That's whole nother problem, right? So that's interesting. I found so this obviously from the paper that we wrote about relevance realization, that's also a fundamental consequence of this. And I think Hazok Chang, who we had on here before, has this most clear definition of that, of the mind. So the reality is not under our control, but it is also not mind independent for him. So these two do not contradict each other, because there is a reality that the tree still makes a noise if it falls in the woods, but if there's nobody to hear it, there is no concept of the tree, of the noise, and the woods. And so I think he's done in his book called Realism for Realistic People. That's Daniel, by the way, a philosophical reading recommendation as well that I have.
Who is that? What's the name?
So Hazok Chang, I'll put him into the chat. But
because that's what.
So let's see if there are other questions. Frank, Adam, you wanted to actually answer this still? Yes.
Well, all I want to do is so my codification of this is, of course, there's a world without us, right? We're not going to, there's a world without us for sure. But it's not this one, like this one, right? Of the idea of a tree with with a branch falling and the sounds. That is part of our embodied experience share, and it's just that it's like Kant's, thing in itself. What can you say about the world without us? I don't think there's much to say about it, because, there's nothing we can apply to it that will allows us to make sense of it. That's just my thought.
Okay, I would have a question if that's all right. Thank you for that interesting talk. I really like the blind spot, and I've been reading Evan's work for quite some time now. And I wanted to ask, like, to the practical consequences of the blind spot, and maybe would hear your opinion on like the neurophenomenological program, where we like Varela talked about mutual constraints between the third person perspective and the first person perspective. And I've been like trying to review a bit what kind of methods are out there, like influenced by neurophenomenology. And so far, I'm not convinced that the change of like an embodied cognitive science and like the neurophenomenological tradition really made an impact in cognitive science or in neuroscience itself. And I'm wondering why is that the case? What would be like the killer argument or the killer experiment that we would have to come up with to convince the people to actually like take this into account in their research practice?
Well, first of all, I'll say you got the wrong guy here. You got the wrong co-author here for that question, because that's Evan, right? Whose work with Varela was foundational, right? With the embodied mind. I think my understanding as I learn more about this is that it's a matter of time. That these questions, when you have a dominant paradigm, what is it? What is it that Planck said? Science progresses one funeral at a time. You have a dominant paradigm. It takes a long time before you're going to see what you have to have is you have to have the old. It's basic paradigm. It's Kuhn. The old thing has to just start developing enough paradoxes and things that don't make sense, that people are kind of getting, especially the younger generations, getting a little exhausted, with the old view. So where the state of things are, my sense is things like just listen, the fact that autopoiesis, I can find the word autopoiesis in scientific papers on the physics of life is remarkable, because when Varela first proposed it, it was kind of seen as like hippie pot smoking science, right? I mean, there were the Lindisfarne Foundation. It was very, sort of seen as being out there. And the fact that you can find autopoiesis now being referenced all over the place is I think a statement to how much the time has come that people have recognized that the old ways just really aren't getting us anywhere. The pure DNA molecule, just for like say biology, that DNA is the determinism. That's clearly not true anymore. We know that genes require networks of activation, and that there's all all these other phenomena that go into that. So like that's one nice example of seeing like the old Dawkinsy kind of model of just biology. It just doesn't work. It can't explain things. So people begin looking at a higher levels for it. I'll say within quantum mechanics, within one of the places I work in do some work in interpretations of quantum mechanics, and just the rise of quantum information theory. Right? So quantum information theory is relatively new. It's the recognition of the importance of measurement, right? So now, for the first time, measurement starts to become deeply codified and becomes an experimental resource that people take on. There's the whole idea of weak measurements and the information gained from that. And out of that, you see the rise of quantum Bayesianism, which still is a minority opinion, but it's, slowly people are, I've just been invited to give a talk on quantum Bayesianism at a quantum information or at a interpretations conference. And what I'm going to present there is the inactive view, because the idea of agency, right? Agency and autonomy actually is central to looking at the Born rule, the rule where measurement comes in quantum mechanics. You have to take into account what is an agent, because it's the agents who pushes on the world by making a measurement, and then the world pushes back. And so, this language of agency and autonomy now suddenly offers an entirely different way of thinking about quantum mechanics in a way that has some experimental, hooks in it and such. So I can't answer your question directly because I'm not in it. So maybe hopefully you guys have, Evan can make it and I'll sit in. And he can answer your question. But I do get the sense that a lot of these things, when they were first proposed, were just too out there, and now the world is catching up with them in some sense.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a very interesting, your take on that. Maybe like the question would be more interesting, how to convince the physicist, because I have some background in physics, and one of the things that struck me, how puzzled quantum physicists are about Wigner's friend paradox. That like an observer, observing another observer, they cannot have a shared reality. And like coming from this like embodied perspective, I was like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But the physicists were like, oh, this is such a paradox. How do we get out of there?
Physicists should get out more,
Sorry.
Physicists should get out more, have more friends.
Go to parties more often. But it's interesting, like, right, the Wigners, there's been this since like, what was this, maybe like 5 years ago, the Renner, etc. paper. The Wigner's friend thing suddenly is back. Like nobody cared about Wigner's friend. And now all of a sudden there's like paper after paper being done on Wigner's friend. I think like it's just the time has come where agency and autonomy are becoming, we're recognizing them. And with AI, recognizing them as central problems.
I mean, that's a very optimistic view. It's still very marginalized, especially in the AI discussion. I'm very surprised. So there is a very simple argument against simulation being the real thing. That is, when you simulate your bike, you still can't write that simulation to work, and that's not a very difficult argument to make, but it seems to be very hard to understand for a lot of AI nerds that it's as simple as that, basically.
They play too many video games.
Yeah, that's true.
Like me, I play a lot of video games, so it's like, oh yeah, of course. Sure,
it can't be that then. Yeah. Okay, I think Andrea had a question.
So I stumbled about some concepts you used in your book. This one was this bifurcation of nature, and the other one was abstraction and connection with models. So I somehow Yogi already mentioned Hazak Chang's book, and I agree with Hazak that science is a human activity. So we are doing science, or humans are doing science. So I think this bifurcation is misleading. For me, it's misleading. So scientists make choices when they construct models, and models are not just abstractions for me. So models are something which are constructed, because you have, with a specific purpose in mind. You have a question, or a scientist has a question who wants to ask a question or get an answer to the questions via models, via experiments. And so I think what we are doing and what we are seeing is also what I think it's something that is promising about science, that science is able to correct itself, to see that there are frictions, there are things we have stumbled over, that some concepts like information don't work when we come to biology. So what does it mean, information, which is a term introduced from computational science or engineering, we introduce in biology, and we say, okay, it doesn't work. So we ask new questions, construct new models or perform new experiments. So I'm a little bit concerned if there is not too much of a black and white drawing, or is there much more of a gray area in science, which we also should recognize by accepting that it's humans who are doing it.
I agree with that. I agree with that, and that's why one of our other heroes, my brain is not working now, but the philosopher who wrote, How the Laws of Physics Lie, the
Nancy Cartwright.
Not Nancy Cartwright, right? The dappled world. So yeah, no, I think we agree with that. The problem is that the blind spot is this idea, the totalizing view of these theories, which is especially in my field of theoretical physics, right? It's like the laws of physics. And we literally treat them as if they were like inscribed on, some stone floating in the, in the Ethereum. So that's the problem, is that we've taken these things as being, having this kind of other existence. Whereas in fact, I agree, science is a human activity. That's why the idea of the workshop is so important to us. That, science is this human activity where human beings got together they figured out how to do this in a very formalized way, especially when it came to experiments, where you isolate the system from all external causes and you vex it, as Francis Bacon would say. So I agree with what you're saying, and that answer may be part of when we talk about a future where physicists or scientists and philosophers have much deeper communication. That view, that recognition would be fundamental. That each one of these is a human endeavor, shows us something powerful about the world. The world pushes back. Let's come up with an account of it. But it's never some kind of totalizing view.
But I think, there are historians of science, philosophers of science who have discussed this. One is it's Pickering. I have to look it up. He was one of the first, or I remember, who talked about this kind of resistance. Scientists are always facing resistance, and this is what make you change your models or whatever your scientific endeavor. So, and I think I'm a physicist by training, so I remember that when I come from spin glasses, so there was these systems which nobody really understood what's going on, kind of complexity, which, we don't have to talk about all this, but, I could also, so these were, this prompt new questions, new ways of looking at things. And I think this makes me also optimistic why, this bifurcation is not something, which is total.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. The problem again is just that there's such a gap between often the practicing scientist and then the philosophy. Because, when I'll talk to, I have one friend in particular who's lovely to talk to, but he's always like, what has philosophy ever done? Tell me something why I should care about philosophy. And, I'll try and point out these things, because for most scientists, particularly with these in the communities I deal with, there's just this sort of sense like, I'm just doing science. It's a kind of naive realism. I'm just doing science. I'm just getting understanding about the world. It is the world. It's not that I'm working on a particular problem. There needs to be, hopefully, listen, and if science goes this direction, it'll just be inherent in it, the understanding of what you actually are doing when you're doing science, right?
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Tom, next question.
Yeah, what I detect sometimes is what you might call a fear of mechanism, a fear of disenchantment. And so the one, I don't know if it's a premise or just sort of an assumption, is that experience can't be reduced. And we all know that there are many people engaged in trying to explain phenomenal consciousness, either from a physicalist perspective, a representationalist perspective, what have you. There's lots of work being done in it. So I guess, Adam, I'm wondering, you say we'll never reduce experience. And as someone else pointed out, or mentioned, the phenomenological approach doesn't, I don't know, that it has that much new or different to add, or the enactive approach. But is it sort of an article of faith that we can't understand direct experience? We'll never get to the bottom of phenomenal consciousness, what it's like to feel pain, see red?
That's a great question, Tom. Thank you. And I think I'm going to say that I'm going to take it as a philosophical assumption. Absolutely, right? And that's why I'm interested in mimicry, right? Because I'm not saying, like, mechanism is awesome, right? That, this is science often can uncover mechanisms. But I think it is, for me, an assumption that it is where I begin, right? It's an axiom for me that experience is given. It's given, and it's the givenness, the suchness, someone like, because again, part of this actually, we never talk about the philosophies that emerge out of the other civilizational cores, like, the classical philosophies of India and Asia. So people like, Nagarjuna or Vasubandhu, or, Dimalakirti, who developed these like very profound logics, etc., that started from the assumption that experience, and more, and for them it was actually empirical because of contemplative practice, of that experience was like, look, there's just no way of getting outside. The only experience you have is the experience as a first person experiencer. And so yeah, it's an axiom that I begin with, that suchness, givenness, is exactly what it is. And so, I can't explain givenness. I may be able to develop mechanisms, to mimic aspects of it, but, raw appearance, and even Hawking knew this, right? With that great quote, he said, "What breeds the fire into the equation?" Right? So if you have a bunch of equations,
He claimed that, but he didn't know it. To me, it's not been proven that suchness is beyond explanation. There are people working on this problem in terms of representational content, for instance. What it's like might be derivative in some way from the content of certain neural representations. Now, I don't say that this has at all been proven, but I think you can't really assume legitimately as a scientist that something is beyond reduction, beyond explanation. That seems to me kind of, I don't know, it's sort of putting up a barrier to explanation. You said earlier, we can only mimic and not explain, which seems to me sort of contrary to the whole scientific project.
Can I throw in something here at this point?
Please,
because I think the reduction is not about an inability to explain primarily, but it is this fact that you cannot even think about anything without assuming that you exist. So in the book I'm writing, I transport Descartes' meditation into today's world and make it naturalistic rather than skeptical. And you end up with, I experience, therefore I am. Not, well, we can talk about what I is there for a long time, maybe in another session, but it is not possible to experience anything if there isn't a subject, and it isn't possible to say anything or know anything without having a locus of experience. And I think this is the kind of blind spot that is irreducible, not in the sense that we cannot explain it, because that's what we're trying to do, and that's what Adam and Evan and Marcelo, I think, are trying to do also in the book, but not reduce it in the sense of we can't explain it away. And I think, so this is something that mechanicists do very often, is explain things away. So I accept mechanicism as a perspective, but I don't accept it as an approach, but I don't accept it as a worldview, because it is simply denying that there is a metaphysical edifice of assumptions that's very rickety underneath mechanistic science, which I tried to expose in my book. And that so if you have someone come up and saying philosophy is dead, or if you have someone come up say, I don't need any philosophy, to quote Dan Dennett, you can say that they have taken their metaphysical baggage on board without examination, but they have metaphysical baggage all the time. And this is what I would say is what we cannot reduce, right? So this is, and one way of looking at this, it's sort of circular. This question, is the experience primary or is the physical world? Well, neither would exist without the other, right? So it's sort of a co-evolving, co-constructing thing. I try to not say thing right now. It's a process, not a thing. But neither of them can exist without the other, right? Sorry, that was a bit long, but I don't know if that helps. Adam, sorry, I didn't even let you answer.
I just, Tom, I really want to recommend Hans Jonas's essay called "Is God a Mathematician?" Because it's I just read it. My mind is blown. Because what he does is he says, okay, let's assume that God is the kind of mathematician that, Leibniz and all, the kind of thing sort of that you think happens with explanation, right? That the math is the explanation. And it's this incredible argument where he goes through and he says, you know what? That God using, with the perfect computer that can compute the location of every atom in every location would never know that the ear hears or the eye sees, because all it would have is just arrangements and of matter flowing through, but the interiority would never be present for it. And so that's why this famous quote from this, only life knows life. So I highly recommend that essay just for you to see sort of what this argument sort of what form it takes about the push against mathematics as being somehow formally complete to be able to quote unquote explain experience.
Yeah, well, I certainly attempts to explain experience needn't involve eliminating it. That should be put aside. Greedy reductionism is what Dennett called it, right? So we don't have to go there, but I don't think it's outlandish to suppose that the fact that we do have this conscious personal window on the world, you're right, we can't put that aside. That's always going to be there. It's irreducible in that sense. You can't be a pure mathematician and be unconscious. And well, I don't know. AI is starting to broach this question. But anyway, I don't mean to suggest that consciousness should be reduced away, only that the idea of phenomenality, of subjectivity, of experience could be tractable from, say, a representationalist perspective. So I'll stop there.
Good questions, though. Yeah.
So this is fantastic. So I want to be mindful of Adam's time, and I also have a question that is still burning as a science communicator myself, and it's not got anything to do with the science, but with the communication part. So if I may, I will take the privilege of finishing with that question. And that is, when I try to explain these sort of perspectivist philosophies and or pragmatist philosophies of science, then people say, but you can't say that to the general public because they will lose trust in science. It relativizes everything, but it's exactly not the case. It doesn't relativize, it just makes it adequate for limited human beings. So how do you deal with this conflict? Is the blind spot perceived and picked up by reactionary, anti-scientific critics sometimes? And how do you walk that tightrope between criticizing science, which we must because science needs to change, and not feeding into the anti-science movement that is very pernicious at the moment?
Yeah, so it's actually quite easy. You just say, like, it's not science. Like, the problem is not science. The problem is a bunch of people who have a philosophical view, whether or not they know it or not, and it's always, it's the problem. It's a metaphysics. It's a metaphysics that got glued onto science. Science is this most beautiful human invention, a way of interrogating the world and listening to its answers on its own, right? But then comes this metaphysics about this, that, and the other thing. And when people are triumphalists, like, so Tom, I love Tom's position. So Tom, this is a great argument for us to have, right? about the back and forth. But what you get is people making statements in public about science says you are nothing but your atoms, and you say, or that, there's no free will. There's just, so it's like, so it's very easy to do this, say, because what you really want to point to, most people feel the open-endedness of their lives, right? And so to come to them and say, like, oh, actually, science is really interested in the open-endedness of your life, as opposed to saying you're a meat computer, You know, like most people don't want to hear they're a meat computer. The meat computer idea is a philosophy. It's not what science says. So by distinguishing what science, the claims for what science says versus this beautiful open-ended process of inquiry, I think that's the way to distinguish them.
Fantastic. This is a good spot to end. I would like to thank everyone who participated in the discussion, especially Adam for coming here. And I am impressed also by your science communication work. And you suffered through 3 hours of Lex Fridman. Can you tell me, would he pass a Turing test?
I gotta say, I really had a great time with Lex. He was really, because I do a lot of those things. And I've done Rogan, and I've Lex. That was a really fun conversation I had with him, because he was asking, like, he'd ask a question, then he'd ask a deeper question, and he'd ask go deeper, and it was really, the back and forth with him was very, very pleasurable. And even afterwards when we talked, we talked about AI and such, and he's got that chill vibe, right? He's with a tie. But I really, really enjoyed that conversation. As somebody who does science communication, that he allowed me to go in depth in a way that I've had that is not often. I don't get to do that. So
fantastic. Thanks a lot, everyone. And we have Kate Nave next month talking about the free energy principle. And then we have Evan Thompson, Adam's co-author. We had the lucky accident that Evan couldn't make it today. So we have 2 blind spot sessions, which is better than 1, I would say. So thanks a lot to everyone.
See you guys.
I hope to see you back.